were the Vikings? Just saying the word Viking elicits an image of a notoriously violent bunch of people that wreaked havoc across Europe in the Middle Ages. But at their core, they were explorers. Hi, I'm Rich Burnett for Wondrium, and in this episode of Perspectives, 5 experts take a look at these infamous explorers whose voyages left an indelible mark in our imaginations. We begin now with a look at what the term Viking actually means.
Who were the Vikings? Properly, they should be called Norsemen, people of the North. They came from Scandinavia, what is today Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, and they were fierce, warlike pagans at the time that they descended onto Europe. The specific word Viking is actually a kind of professional label or even job description. To go on Viking means to go on a raid. A vik is an inlet or a fjord, and Viking or Viking was thus the name for someone who stealthily moved his ship close to the shore, up an inlet, and then attacked the locals. Viking journeys of pillage began in the 700s, and they terrorized significant parts of Europe for 2 centuries. When people saw the dragon-headed ships of the Vikings coming closer from the sea, they would be well advised to flee. The first onslaughts of the Vikings were a terrible shock. This frightening phenomenon erupted out of nowhere with the attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of Britain in the year 793. It was a place where monks, among them Irish like St. Brendan, prayed and worked peacefully. After the Viking sack of Lindisfarne, a chronicler wrote that, quote, "The pagans have contaminated God's shrines and spilled out the blood of saints. Around the altar they have laid waste the house of our consolation, and in the temple of God they have trampled underfoot the bodies of saints like dung in the streets." Soon, throughout Christian lands, a new prayer was added to the liturgy, which implored, "From the fury of the Norsemen, O Lord, preserve us." What made the Norsemen's attacks so fearful was that they covered huge distances and appeared suddenly without warning. In particular, they sailed across large expanses of open waters without land in sight, at a time when this was seen as kind of crazy in Europe. Remember from the days of Pythias the Greek how in the Mediterranean, it was well advised to sail hugging the coasts, keeping land in sight in case of a storm or an emergency. The Norsemen were able to challenge the open sea because their culture had special attributes, a strong sailor ethos and a maritime tradition that grew out of the very physical environment of the Scandinavian peninsula. It is a place where the sea is always nearby in fjords or inlets.
The Vikings were able to pioneer naval raiding due to their incredible seamanship and advanced shipbuilding techniques. Scandinavia had a very long history of shipbuilding, dating back at least to the Bronze Age, but they had made significant advances in the centuries right before the Viking raids began due to the influence of the Romans, who introduced the sail to Northern Europe. Their masterpiece was the longship, a hardy, flexible, and lightweight vessel capable of dominating the coasts and rivers of Europe. Longships did rely primarily on dense banks of oars for propulsion, but the addition of the sail gave them the ability to range far more widely when conditions were right. The ability to shift easily from rowing to sailing was enhanced by the replacement of oarlocks with oar ports. Still, the importance of the oars can be gauged by the fact that longships contain pretty much as many oarsmen as could possibly be crammed in. The largest longships could hold 100 men, and in a society of relatively small and isolated settlements, even 1 or 2 such vessels could create a devastating impact. Pretty much everything about these boats made them ideal for raiding. Viking longboats were extremely flexible and slender, and they were clinker-built, which means that they were constructed of planks that overlapped each other and were then riveted together, as opposed to the system in use elsewhere in Europe, in which planks were sawed and then joined together. Clinker-built vessels were stronger because of the overlap, and they were made even more watertight by a caulk composed of tarred cow's hair. Longships were also very lightweight, which means that they could be transported easily overland. For example, if it was necessary to cross from one landing point to another body of water. They also had a very shallow draft. They could maneuver in water that was only 1 meter or 3 feet deep, which made it easy for them to come right up on shore to let loose a raiding party. They were also able to travel up the rivers. So while they started out by raiding islands and coastal sites, they rather quickly graduated to traveling on the river systems of Britain and Ireland and northwestern Europe. And they could penetrate hundreds of miles inland. In addition, longships were built symmetrically with identical front and back ends so that they could reverse direction as needed, much the way a subway car can face forwards or back, thus saving the need to maneuver around in the water. The most famous thing that many people picture when they imagine a longboat is a carved dragon's head on the prow. We do have medieval illustrations of boats with dragon's heads, but it was certainly not true that all Viking ships had them. Apparently, the heads were detachable. They were intended to scare away the spirits that were protecting your enemies. And we have later reports that when Vikings returned to Iceland, they would take the heads off when returning to port because they didn't want to scare away their own protective spirits. One of the most interesting questions with regard to the Vikings is how they navigated across the open ocean between Scandinavia and Britain. Scholars have various opinions about Viking navigation. Some scholars maintain that the Vikings used largely traditional methods to navigate, like familiarity with the tides and various landmarks. But other scholars believe that the Vikings had access to more sophisticated methods, such as the use of devices that would help them spot the direction of the sun even when the sky was completely overcast. One that has been debated is the so-called sunstone, which is alluded to in an Icelandic saga. It may refer to a type of mineral calcite that can polarize light and thus potentially be used to find the sun even in overcast or snowy conditions, and thus aid navigation. We may never know, but at this point, the balance of evidence lies with those who believe the Vikings used largely their hard-won experience of sailing in the northern seas to do what they did. And that makes their achievements even more remarkable.
The raid on Lindisfarne shocked and traumatized observers throughout English Christendom. The chronicler's emotional recounting of a miserable devastation of heathen men through pillage and slaughter echoes the sentiments of most historical accounts of the Vikings, which paint the attackers as bloodthirsty and violent to a disturbing degree. Seasonal raiding would continue to harry all the kingdoms of England, off and on, for most of the next century. And for the rest of the pre-Norman conquest period, Scandinavians would have a regular presence in England. But that presence was by no means uniform. Different groups from different places under different leaders would come for very different purposes. So while English sources like the Chronicle tend to lump all Scandinavians under a single heading, like Northmen or Danishmen or heathen army, they're actually describing a fairly wide range of folks, not all of whom were there for pillage and slaughter. Some, it's true, did come as raiders, interested primarily in plundering communities for their wealth and then sailing back home with the treasure. But others came as traders or settlers, looking for business opportunities or land to farm. Driven overseas by growing populations and land scarcity back in Scandinavia, many of them wanted to call England their new home. The first half of the 9th century saw mainly raiding parties, like the ones who sacked Lindisfarne, striking centers where they knew they could find wealth. Sometimes they would completely devastate a region. On other occasions, local leaders were able to buy them off with tribute, the so-called Danegeld, in exchange for leaving them in peace. They certainly had a profound impact on the safety and security of English communities, but they would attack and then leave once they had what they came for, with little lasting influence. By the middle of the 9th century, this began to change, and the raiding parties that had struck seasonally and then went home were replaced by an army of conquest. The turning point came in 865 CE, when a massive force landed in East Anglia, led by the sons of legendary Norse king Ragnar Lothbrok, who had been executed by King Ella of Northumbria a few years earlier.
For the first time in 865, an actual Viking army landed in East Anglia, intent not just on raiding, but on conquering Anglo-Saxon Britain. It was led by the unforgettably named Ivar the Boneless, and is remembered in English history as the Great Heathen Army. It marched north, sacked Whitby, captured York, and seemed all set to dominate the whole of Britain. Opposition came from the kings of Wessex, Ethelred, and then his brother Alfred the Great, who ruled from 871 until 899. Alfred is the only English king ever to be called the Great. His achievement was to prevent Viking conquest of the whole country. At one point, he was forced into hiding in the marshlands of Athelney, Somerset, where a monument to him still stands. Seeking shelter with an old peasant woman, according to legend, she asked him to keep an eye on the cakes she was baking. Preoccupied by his precarious military situation, he forgot. The cakes got burned, and the woman berated him, only to discover moments later that she was boxing the ears of her king. Archaeological work at Athelney has shown that this was the site of an Iron Age fort, that Athelney was an island, often surrounded by flooded fields, and that a causeway led from it to nearby East Ling. Signs of metalworking in the area also suggest that Alfred and his followers cast weapons there in preparation for their counterattack on the Vikings. Another legend has Alfred cleverly disguised as a minstrel, spying on the Viking camp. Whatever the merits of the legend, it is true that his army won a decisive victory against the Viking general Guthrum at Edington in 878.
The peace agreement, known as the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, was signed in 886. As a rare survival from this period, it offers a fascinating window into Anglo-Norse relations. Under the terms of the treaty, Guthrum agreed to accept baptism as a Christian, and Alfred stood as his godfather. Guthrum also agreed to retreat to a territory that would become known as the Danelaw, which would exist as a separate kingdom alongside Alfred's now enlarged kingdom of Wessex. It was a massive territory made up of East Anglia, Northumbria, and Eastern Mercia, roughly the same size as the newly combined kingdoms of Wessex and Western Mercia. Its border ran more or less along a line from London in the southeast to Chester in the northwest. Within the Danelaw, Guthrum was a sovereign ruler, not a vassal of King Alfred, and the treaty sets up laws for both rulers to follow. Alfred and Guthrum's treaty also makes it clear that the populations will remain separate, specifying that neither enslaved nor freemen should be allowed to travel into the Danish population without permission, any more than any of them should to us. In other words, Guthrum's subjects will remain Guthrum's, and Alfred's subjects will remain Alfred's. No poaching of people back and forth. But it doesn't forbid interaction, and it makes particular provisions for trade, indicating that both Alfred and Guthrum recognized that peaceful business exchanges across their borders would benefit both kingdoms. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum established terms that enabled English and Danes to live peacefully for many decades. It didn't prevent violence altogether, but it did put an end to the threat of invasion and conquest, and it set up conditions for a vibrant exchange between the two cultures over the next 2 centuries. The Scandinavians had different customs and practices for daily life. Their religion, paganism, was anathema to most English Christians, and their language, Norse, was closely related to Old English, but the two tongues were different enough that speakers would have to work to understand one another. The existence of a massive population of Scandinavian immigrants settling down and living side by side with their English neighbors couldn't help having profound impacts on the development of English language and culture.
From the 790s, Vikings raided Western France and started actually settling there in the 840s. Vikings even attacked Paris in the year 845. The King of France finally was forced to give the Norsemen the Duchy of Normandy from among his other territories in exchange for their agreeing to Christian baptism. Indeed, the name says it all. Normans means Norsemen. The Vikings invaded Ireland from 830, establishing there a great trading city, Dublin. They also invaded England and took York, which became the center of Viking rule. In 1016, the Norse hero Knut the Great became King of England. The area that was under Norse rule was called the Danelaw, where the Norsemen forced the English to pay protection money, which was called Danegeld. Paying Danegeld, perhaps in the short term, brought security, but as has been pointed out, once you pay the Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane again. And of course, coming from France, those one-time Vikings, the Normans, would go on to invade England under William the Conqueror in 1066. While many Vikings went west, others went to the east, to what is today Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, and even Iraq. There, they seized local people and sold them as slaves. The word slave in English actually comes from the ethnic name Slav, the people of Eastern Europe. In Novgorod, Norsemen were invited to establish a state there under their control, and they gave their name to Russia, which comes from Rus, a Scandinavian word apparently meaning oarsman. Down in the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople, Norsemen served as mercenaries when they were not busy attacking that city. These were the famed Varangian guards of the Byzantine emperors. So, from one end of Europe to the other, there were Viking empires on the seas, from the Faroe Islands to Sicily in the Mediterranean to Russia. Success of this sort started to mellow the Norsemen over time. Eventually, many Vikings were domesticated and started settling down, becoming integrated into the new areas they'd colonized and accepting Christianity, about the time of Leif Eriksson, around the year 1000. Leif was a convert to Christianity, and he'd been sent to Greenland as a Christian missionary by King Olaf of Norway. The journeys that followed were recorded in sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. These were oral traditions that were written down around the year 1250. Now, they're not completely reliable historical sources in all particulars, but they do offer very suggestive hints about these people and what drove them. To find this mysterious new land that Bjarni had stumbled upon, Leif set out around the year 1001 with 35 men. He wanted his father Eric to come along on this journey, because Eric was considered the man with the best fortune in their family, the man with the best luck. But an omen intervened when Eric fell from his horse just before the trip, and thus he declined to go. Here's another clue to Viking culture. Fortune, or luck, were tremendously valued and sought. After sailing several hundred miles, Leif's expedition reached land. First, they encountered what they called Helluland, which means flat stone land, and many people consider this might be Baffin Island in Canada. Sailing further, they came to what they called Markland, the land of the forest, and it's unclear where this was, perhaps Labrador, perhaps Newfoundland. Then they saw a third land, even more attractive, and they plunged ahead and their ship ran aground. The Greenlander saga says, their curiosity to see the land was so great that they could not be bothered to wait for the tide to come in and float their stranded ship. Instead, they jumped in a small boat and rowed ashore. There, they built houses to overwinter, and they found berries or grapes and called this place Vinland, land of berries or land of wine grapes. The ambiguity here as to which is correct comes from the fact that the Norse called berries and wine grapes by the same name. Some scholars actually believe it was cranberries that they located in this new land.
Wherever Vinland was, the Vikings were delighted with their new exploration. They loaded their ship with grapes and wood and sailed back to Greenland, arriving safely. From then on, Leif was known as Leif the Lucky. Vinland became a destination that drew subsequent explorers, including, as we will see, Leif's sister Freydis. But explorers would find this new land, unlike Greenland, was not empty. They encountered native peoples with violent results. In about 1010, a wealthy merchant named Karlsefni was drawn to the wealth of the New World. According to Eriksson's saga, in this voyage, Karlsefni took his wife, Gudrid, and 4 other women, including Erik's daughter Freydis and her husband, Thorvard. They apparently planned to settle, for he brought cattle along with him. I can't imagine bringing these animals on the rough North Atlantic crossing, but these incredible sailors didn't even remark on it as if it were unusual. They landed in Vinland and established a camp for the winter. In spring, the natives appeared in large numbers, coming to their summer camps by the coast. At first, both groups entered into trade. The natives wanted swords and weapons, which the Vikings refused to give them. Then the natives settled for red cloth, for which they exchanged furs and hides. When the red cloth ran out, the women brought the natives milk, which they had never tasted before. Soon the natives wanted only milk. But the two groups never trusted each other, and when a bull belonging to Karlsefni came charging out of the woods, the natives interpreted this as an aggressive act. They fled, but returned in force, prepared for battle. At first, the outnumbered Vikings were driven back, and they retreated to some cliffs where they prepared to take a stand. At this point, Freydis came out of her house and mocked the fleeing Vikings. According to Eriksson's saga, she said, "Why do you flee from such pitiful wretches? Brave men like you, you should be able to slaughter them like cattle. If I had weapons, I'm sure I could fight better than any of you." They ignored her and continued to flee. Freydis tried to follow them, but she could not keep up because she was pregnant. The natives were closing in on her when she came across a dead Viking with his sword beside him. She snatched up the sword and prepared to defend herself. When the natives came rushing at her, she pulled one of her full breasts out of her tunic, faced the natives, and slapped her naked breast with the side of her sword, daring them to attack her. The natives were so surprised at this vision, they fled back to their boats and hurried away. Karlsefni and his men came over to Freydis and praised her courage and credited her with saving their lives. They returned to their settlement and made plans to leave. As the saga recounts, Karlsefni realized that although the land was excellent, they could never live here safely or free from fear because of the native inhabitants. So they returned to Greenland. In this contact, the natives successfully persuaded the Europeans to stay away.
And there, at that point, the historical record peters out. There may have been other later trips for timber, but the Vikings did not announce the news of what they had found more broadly. Other Europeans did not hear of their discoveries. From the perspective of the Norse, why would you share the news of these resources and just invite competitors? It would be centuries before Europeans returned to these places, until John Cabot arrived in 1497 to claim this area for England. Eventually, the Greenland colony, which at its height had some 4,000 people, also withered. It was too dependent on ships to bring supplies. As the climate cooled in the Little Ice Age around the year 1200, the colony finally died out.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about the topics in this episode, the full list of series that these clips came from is in the description below. You can watch them all now on Wondrium.